In 2022, 274 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance and protection. Preventing, mitigating, and responding to humanitarian crises is a challenge. Can fiction and storytelling play a role? Can it raise awareness and motivate action to address the causes and consequences of humanitarian crises? My name is Ruth Mukwana, and I host the SAHA podcast, Stories and Humanitarian Action. Welcome to the SAHA Pod, Stories and Humanitarian Action. I have a great guest for you today. Before I introduce him, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to my YouTube channel, like, comment, and share this video. My guest today is Sébastien Trives, who is a French national born in 1970, currently working for the NGO ACTED in Paris. Prior to that, he worked as director of the Humanitarian Advisory Team to the Famine Relief Fund. He also worked as head of the OCHA office for Yemen and Syria, and as chief of section with OCHA again in New York. Mr. Trives also worked for UNRWA in Gaza for 5 years, 4 of which he spent as deputy director of UNRWA operations in charge of emergency programs. Between 2000 and 2006, he worked in Afghanistan, first as country director for ACTED, and then from 2003 to 2006 as head of the UNAMA regional office for the southeastern region. He started his international career with the OSCE mission in Tajikistan as field officer. He holds an MA in international relations, a BA in International Affairs and History, and a diploma in European Studies. Welcome today, and thank you for making the time to speak with me.
Thank you, Ruth. It's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to see you again.
Yeah, and I know we spoke a little bit last time when we were preparing for this podcast, actually, and before I do that, let me just ask you, how did you end up in the humanitarian sector?
It was by chance, in a sense, that I ended up working as a humanitarian. As you just mentioned, I worked for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in Tajikistan in the late 90s, focusing on non-humanitarian work. It was after the Tajik civil war, and I was based for 2 years in the south of the country in a place called Dusti, which is just right on the Afghan border. And I grew very fond of Central Asia, and I met with a number of humanitarians who were operating from Tajikistan into Afghanistan. And at the time, so I developed a bit of a fascination for Afghanistan. And at the time, in order to be able to work there and live there, there wasn't a whole lot you could do except for humanitarian work. This was the first Taliban government. So I got a job as country director for the NGO ACTED that I'm again working for in 2000. So it's through Afghanistan that I became a humanitarian, and I had learned basically from scratch because I didn't know much about it when I started working as a humanitarian in 2000.
Right. And what does ACTED do?
So, what ACTED is a generalist French NGO, which has been created in Afghanistan in the mid-90s. What I'm focusing on in ACTED is a program called Agora, and basically it's an attempt to plan and deliver aid in a way that grounds it in local knowledge and delivers in a way that empowers people, local people and local communities, and is more accountable to them. So to use our jargon, it's a methodology that attempts to very practically implement this accountability to affected people, localization, and nexus agenda. And I mean, these are all big words, but in practical terms, it has a number of features. Number one, it's an area-based approach. So it looks at territories rather than sectors, and it tries to use territories that make sense to the local community. So we're not looking at imposing arbitrary territorial distinctions that don't pre-exist. We try to work with community interfaces that are legitimate and accountable, not creating new ones. And then the whole idea is to help people, communities and local authorities develop their own priorities, and then help them implement that either directly by carrying out programs, implementing projects that we pick from the priorities that they have laid out in their recovery plans, or giving visibility to these priorities with other actors, the government, or coordination structures. So that's what we're trying to do. It's a way to rethink how we do aid, and of course, when people articulate their priorities, it's never going to be just humanitarian or recovery or development. It's of course a mix of both. So yeah, we're piloting this in a number of countries. It's very interesting, and we hope that it will bring aid that is more effective and more accountable to people.
Yeah. No, and I know you've, excuse me, you've mentioned it already. One of the challenges is actually how do we empower people more, and how are we accountable as a humanitarian community to the people that we are there to help. I'm going to come back to you to ask you a little bit about more Afghanistan. But before I do that, I did want to ask you as well, like, what do you enjoy the most about your job?
I mean, what about this particular job? What I enjoy is that it's allowing me to kind of take stock and reflect on almost 20 plus years of work, mostly in the humanitarian field, and try to draw lessons from that and apply them to improve the way we deliver, both as an organization, but also try to also find ways to propose new approaches to the system. So that's exciting, of course. It's this idea of local knowledge is also particularly interesting, because it means you need to understand the contexts that you're working in a way that's much more nuanced than is normally the case when we do humanitarian work. So it also forces you to try to apprehend the context in which you work in, the different ways of thinking, the different modes of existence, so to speak, if I can use big terms. And that's intellectually challenging. It brings together the nuts and bolts of humanitarian work, the programming, the program cycle, the projects, and so on and so forth, with some other elements, looking at anthropology, looking at ethnology, and all this, which I very much like. So in this particular job, that's what I find interesting. Yeah.
And another question just about you is, if you had to think about through all of these years that you've been working in the humanitarian sector, one thing what's your greatest achievement? Like one thing you're really proud of doing?
I think, I mean, it's difficult to say that one is proud about, because it's never really your own individual achievement. It's a collective achievement, so to speak. So I think that the one thing that I found most both frustrating but also very rewarding in my more recent experience is working in Syria, where I was part of a broader team, of course. And what was very peculiar about the Syria response, of course, as you know, it was one of the larger, it was the largest protection humanitarian access crisis at the time. And the worst violations of international norms were being committed. Use of chemical weapons and besiegement, targeting of civilian objects, and all that. And there was very little response from the international community that would translate into a change in the way that the conduct of war was being brought forward. So we as humanitarians were in this situation very much alone in the country, trying to deliver in a very difficult situation. And because we were the only representatives of the multilateral system in country, there was a lot of confusion around our role. People inside the country, naturally, understandably, and people also outside looking at us were wondering why we were not able to end sieges and prevent protection violations. And so, of course, this was beyond our means as humanitarians. But what I found most interesting, and I guess we can be proud of it as a system and as OCHA, I would say, is that that we could have just said, well, these are the cards that have been dealt to us as humanitarians. We can't really influence the parameters of this. We'll just do the best we can and deliver what we can deliver. But we didn't do that. I think this was a very good example of the system really trying to leave no stone unturned to try to affect the parameters of what was possible. And the way it did this was by engaging with politics, basically. Mm-hmm. There are three things in particular that I think the system did well. Number one was to decide that it would want to engage with the Security Council to pass a humanitarian resolution. There was no space for a political resolution, of course. Everybody knew that. But there was a thinking that perhaps there was a space for a humanitarian resolution, and that was the result of that was Resolution 2165, which enabled cross-border, but also provided a forum every month for the humanitarians to advocate for protection and for access in Syria, in particular access to besieged areas. And the second thing that I think we can take particularly pride in is that and I think this is really a OCHA thing, we came together and arranged our work so that we could create the evidence base required to support, to inform the narrative that humanitarian leaders needed to make a compelling case to the Security Council on access. So we created an access analysis framework that essentially looked at Syria through the lens of access. So what is besieged, what is not besieged, what is hard to reach, how that was evolving. And that had to be robust and had to be, withstand scrutiny. Mm-hmm. You can imagine scrutiny, public scrutiny. So we did that. And at the same time, there was an operational element to this because, of course, we were asking for access, not just advocating. We wanted to go in. So we set up with our partners, the UN agencies and ICRC, a whole system to deliver interagency convoys, aid convoys to besieged and hard to reach areas, mm-hmm. military control areas, whenever we had the opportunity to do so. So that was, of course, a huge amount of work, but it was very, I think, instrumental in making sure that we could really get as much mileage as possible from this Security Council forum. And the last thing that we did, again related to politics, is that there was a special envoy in charge of trying to bring the parties together. And there was a decision, again, to work with that special envoy on humanitarian access issues. There was a group of countries that came together, co-led by Russia and the Russian Federation and the US, with Jan England, who was appointed as a special advisor, humanitarian advisor to the special envoy. And that group of countries was dedicated fully and solely to trying to, push humanitarian access, push interagency convoys. And we were there in the country working to try to do that, engaging with them, giving them information. So the combination of the cross-border resolution, the forum that this Security Council resolution provided, the technical work we did to deliver and to inform the narrative, and the work with the special envoy was, I think, very very good. And it's not free of risk, of course, because it's not about instrumentalizing politics. You get also instrumentalized by politics. But I think, in retrospect, we certainly did much more than we would have done in terms of, having better humanitarian outcomes. And I think that's something I reflect on it as something that I was participating in, part of, that I could be proud of. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and thank you for sharing this. I know, working across colleagues from Syria and up to today, it's been a big crisis. And okay, are you still there?
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Because I hear you, but I don't see you, but I think it's fine. It says, yeah.
I see you.
Okay, great. Now I was just saying that, all the work on Syria, I know from colleagues working, including yourself, it's always been very intense, but it's also left a legacy. And I hear you looking at, politics and the humanitarian principles, but it did leave a legacy where actually cross-border operations were possible and sanctioned through the Security Council to actually, as you say, enable better or positive humanitarian outcomes, to really get aid to people who needed it.
Indeed.
Yeah. Can I just come back a bit to Afghanistan? And one of the questions because you've worked there quite a few times, right?
Yeah.
And I wonder,
5 years there.
like, what kind of changes have you seen? And the reason I ask this is that sometimes I feel personally that sometimes some situations just never seem to get better. Or maybe they do and it's just not communicated. But suddenly, what we tend to see, like as I was preparing to speak to you, also because the book we are going to talk about is based in Afghanistan, I was looking at the numbers in the Global Humanitarian Overview for this year. It's like 24.4 million people in need, which is really more than half of the population. I think at the end of last year, Afghanistan had, the second drought in 4 years, highest number of people in emergency food insecurity. Just to me, kind of thinking through, like, you've been there many times. What improvements have you seen, or what is the situation, and what is really driving such extraordinary needs?
Yeah, so I've spent 5 years there working as a humanitarian, also working for the political mission back in the days for 3 years. And then recently I've been spending quite a bit of time in the country. One thing that's clear is that Afghanistan has been, experiencing, going through various levels of humanitarian needs. It's been in a humanitarian crisis for more than 40 years, right? But it's really taken a turn for the worst since August, and it's what's clear is that we're talking about different types of needs here. Before August, most of the needs were related to the insurgency, the conflict, the displacement, and then protection issues around that. Now, most of these types of needs have receded largely because there is much less conflict. In fact, the country has been more or less at peace for the first time in 42 years. But you have, because of the takeover of the Taliban, you have a very, very harsh economic situation, very difficult economic situation, because of the fact that all foreign aid, and the country was heavily dependent on foreign aid, has been cut except for humanitarian assistance. So I was reading an ICG report recently that mentioned that this was the biggest economic shock any country had experienced in recent history. So the impact is really tremendous. There's no question. Of course, there's less of the negative impact of conflict because there's less conflict. But now there's many more people in need of humanitarian assistance. As you mentioned, more than half the country is in need of assistance. It's particularly acute in urban areas, because here this is a country that's been urbanizing very quickly. We now have about 30% of the population in urban areas, up from 5% in 20 years ago. And these people, for the most part, are reliant on commerce and are relying on public sector salaries, and these have been either not paid or there's been a huge economic downturn. So very difficult for these people. In rural areas, as you said, there's been years of drought, so it's also been difficult. But people are more resilient, and the good news is, going to rural areas a couple of times over the last months, is that there's hope that the harvest will be better, so that will hopefully lessen the blow. I think the one big problem is that the causes of all these needs, of course, are beyond our reach, and they're not beyond the reach of humanitarians to address, and they're not doesn't look like they're going to be addressed anytime soon. It could take a while for them to be addressed. Yeah. So what's really the biggest humanitarian challenge we're facing in Afghanistan now is that the country is going to continue to depend heavily on humanitarian aid, not just to feed a large number of Afghans, but also to keep basic health and education services running, and maybe other services, like a little bit like in Yemen, because humanitarians then come in and are the only ones who can play that role because of political constraints. So that could take a long time, and that's why now on top of that we have the increase of prices related to the Ukraine war and all this. So it's really very important for Afghanistan that the international community is able to stay the course until such time as the political solutions that are needed are found, and that could take some time, that this large-scale humanitarian effort continues, because, of course, this is largely also the result of the history of the last 20 years. So I think we really owe Afghans to at least help them with that as they grapple with their own issues.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think the point you ended up there with, it's like 20 years. So kind of thinking about it, someone who was born 20 years ago has pretty much just lived through a situation that's been, untenable on so many levels. Gonna go into speaking about 99 Nights in Logar, which is the book by Jamil Jan Kocha. Before I do that, I did want to actually get your own perspectives on fiction. Can fiction raise awareness, and can it motivate action to address the causes and consequences of humanitarian crisis? What is your own take?
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure, fiction and literature in more general terms. I mean, I think there are other types of literature that can play that role, and it can do that in a number of ways. And I think the book that we'll talk about illustrates that. I would say that in general, we're living, of course, in a very complex world, and anything that to understand anything in that world, you need time, you need to understand the nuances of things. And it just so happened that we live in a time where we put a big primacy on immediacy. Everything has to be done very quickly. There isn't much time for nuance, and I think literature is very important in our time right now, because it provides that longer time frame for reflection, and it helps us kind of apprehend the world and its complexity. So that applies across the world for all situations, and all human situations. But of course, it also applies for humanitarian settings. And I mean, I guess it's particularly important in humanitarian settings because these settings are most often very distant. Sorry, from I think it's Michael Barnett who wrote a history of humanitarianism, who defined humanitarianism as a, if I'm not mistaken, he said is a governance of acts of compassion across borders. So you have governance, which means unequal power relations, and you have across borders, which means usually very distant places. So it's how do we apprehend this otherness, right? The other modes of thinking, and so literature and fiction can help us understand the context better, give some texture and depth to places that we don't necessarily understand. It can also make us understand, the way people think, and make humanity in those places come to life in a way that's important, because very often we come with our own bias as humanitarians. Of course, that's normal. I mean, in the 19th century, people came with their own bias, imperialist bias or religious bias. It's still the same in some ways. We have to be aware of that. I think it also helps us to think through about our responsibility. So if we understand the places, if we understand the humanity and the various types of humanities that are there, we'll be better in our ability to think through the responsibility that we have in terms of how we deliver. So, the good that we do, the harm that we do, understand that responsibility, remaining vigilant about it. I think literature can help us very much in that regard.
Right. And I know, and I'm glad you mentioned, literature in general can do that. And I know even as I really work on this podcast, as I speak to people, a lot of people often ask me, but why are you not using nonfiction as well? Because nonfiction as well is very, very powerful as well. And I've been really intentional in focusing on fiction, mostly because I personally find it easier to discuss fiction than nonfiction. You're kind of looking at characters that just basically characters that are created, as opposed to discussing people's personal experiences more than anything. But I also know, as we were speaking a couple of weeks ago about what book to discuss, you did make a point about narrative fiction in general as well. And maybe I did want to come back to you on that as well. What do you think about narrative fiction? I mean, I guess let me ask it differently. How do you
narrative nonfiction?
Narrative nonfiction. Okay, I get it now. Okay. Yeah.
No, I mean, narrative nonfiction. I was, the reason why we had this discussion is because I was thinking about the books that I could, come and discuss with you, and one of them was a narrative nonfiction book. A narrative nonfiction is a genre of literature that is fairly new, and therefore I think it's not very widely known. And essentially, it will use a literary style. And a narrative style to describe something that is grounded in reality. So it's not fiction, so to speak. It's nonfiction, but it's being brought forward in a literary style using different literary approaches.
Right.
So it very much, I think, it can very much achieve the same goals as fiction in terms of how. In some of the things that I described, and I'm sure many others, to make us understand and relate to the places where we intervene more intelligently and more effectively.
Right. No, got it. I guess I'll think about that as well, because I've been very, very intentional about just focusing on fiction. But I also speak to a lot of people who say, look, it's very fluid these days. Like, a lot of genres are not just fiction or not nonfiction. There's a lot of people today who are really merging both fiction and nonfiction, and as you're saying, narrative nonfiction as well. 99 Nights in Logar. What is this book about?
So it's that's fiction. It's a novel, and it's a book by an African-American author, Jamil Jan Kuchai, who essentially talks about the vacation of a young boy, 10-year-old boy who is an African-American who comes to Logar on vacation in a fairly rural area. I mean, Logar is rural, but it's in the village, It's not in Puyalam, in the center of the province, and it it talks about those vacations and the family environment, and beyond that, of course, the perception that this boy has of Afghanistan. And I think the reason I wanted to choose this book is, first of all, Afghanistan is a place that that is very dear to me. So I was interested by the book for that reason. The literary style, I think, is great as well. But beyond that, the fact that it's because Afghanistan is a distant land, from my perspective, of course, me being French, the fact that it was, it describes the situation through the eyes of a child. A lot of the story actually takes place between children. It describes family life. It describes the tension between tradition and modernity. It describes the conflict, but it's never central. It's always out there. It really provides this background of Afghanistan in a very endearing light. And of course, because we have this tendency of, I thought it was relevant because we have this tendency in our business, humanitarian business, if I can use that word, to see people as beneficiaries of aid and people, victims, people without agency, numbers, without being derogatory. And I think that book is a great antidote to that, in the way it makes Afghanistan come to life, and the reality of these Afghans and their humanity. So I thought it was a good example.
Yeah, no, and actually, I'm glad we ended up talking a week later because I actually read it. I hadn't read it before.
Oh, you did?
I did, yeah. I did.
Well done.
Yeah, so I'm actually grateful for the extra time to be able to do that. And I hadn't heard about the book until you mentioned it to me, and so I'm always excited actually to also discover new books. One thing that struck me, and I think you've mentioned it, but maybe you can talk more about it. Like children characters are always interesting, and I think I always like reading children narrators anyway. But one thing that struck me is the war is there. It's always in the background, but it is not the focus as such of the novel. And maybe you can say more about that, because I hadn't, and I've read a few fiction books on Afghanistan, but I hadn't really read any book to me that's made the country or the culture more alive than this book did. And as I also read it, I kept thinking, like, this is how Afghans live in this kind of war that went on for so long.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point. I mean, I think the book is beautifully written and interesting because it gives you color, texture. It gives you an understanding of the lives of Afghans, outside of the conflict. Just the life of a family and the interactions that are there. But also the fact that the conflict is in the background there is, in a way, very much the reality. I mean, there's been 40, up to recently, there was ongoing conflict for more than 40 years. So that conflict has very much become the backdrop that people had to live against. And it comes in and out of people's lives, depending, because we're not talking about a high intensity conflict here. But yeah, so in a way, the book is also faithful to the situation of Afghanistan in the way it places the conflict as an important but secondary kind of backdrop.
Yeah, and storytelling. I mean, there's so many stories in this book, and as I was reading, the
Great
story,
stories, yeah.
the stories and the tales, and maybe you can say more about that. But again, I kind of felt, it's a way, I felt it was a way for this family, for these characters to relieve some of the loss, because I think a lot of the stories were actually about what happened at a certain point in the war, or someone who died, someone who lost a relative, whether a brother or a parent, and using storytelling or these tales to share that experience and what happened.
So yes, I didn't mention this. So you have, of course, the narrative thread with this young boy and his friends and what they're doing, right? But you also have throughout people telling stories about the past, about the different characters from the family and how what happened to them, and they're very often related. In fact, I think they're always related to the conflict.
Yeah.
And they bring they go back to the beginning of the revolution or 80s, and they talk about indeed losses. They also talk about the the relationships that exists beyond tribe, beyond ethnicity, beyond even political colors, and somehow how this. I mean, it's been the drama of Afghanistan in a sense, but it's also been there's a sort of resilience that keeps Afghans together. Despite these 40 years of war, and I think these stories are good illustrations of that. When you take them together, they provide a canvas that's interesting. In fact, I hadn't thought of this until you mentioned it.
Yeah. No, and it was funny as well. I mean, there are so many moments that when the boys looking for Buddha Bash, of course, the book starts.
Yes, the dog.
And I can't figure out whether Buddha Bash was actually a dog or not.
Dog monster, it's unclear. Yeah. But I mean, just for people who may listen to us, what I also liked is the way the literary style, which takes it takes you from a very down to earth reality type of setting into kind of psychedelic moments where reality is distorted, and it's beautifully done, of course. But it's also very interesting in that way.
Yeah.
Buddha Bash the dog becomes it becomes something else. Yeah.
Yeah. And, coming back to, I guess, and as I was thinking about, the book as well, I think what you said a little bit about, fiction giving us more nuance, but also dealing with more complex situations. And Mawand, who's actually the main character or the narrator of the book, who's quite an unreliable character as well. But I could not help but love him anyway. And then, with his cousins. But also there was this dynamic going on for the family that I thought was brought out well. A little bit of those who left. So his family came to America, and then those who stayed, and those then in the family who are working with the Americans, and then those who have joined the Taliban. And maybe you can say a bit more about all of those dynamics as well.
Yeah, I mean, the book, by providing these examples, there's indeed, I forgot the name, but there's one uncle working for the Americans as a translator, or not sure. Of course, has access to, a sort of power at the time. And you have the tension between, Afghans who've left the country in the last 30 years and came back after 2001. So it's very, it puts, it shines a light on a very real issue.
Yeah.
And I think beyond that, if we take a step back, what's happened in Afghanistan since August is somehow related to this, because what we've seen a massive exodus of more than 120,000 people were airlifted, right? but many more have left before and after. People continue to leave. I know quite a few people who've left only recently. And these are people who, for the most part, have been associated with the former government, but also just people who, aspire to a more open society. Very often they're urban people. So you have this very strong tension, which is, between the rural world and the urban world, which has grown over the last 20 years. We have now, Kabul, when I started working in Kabul in 2000, was 500,000 people. Now it's 5 million people, or maybe a little less now after the events of August. And I think one of the key challenges for the new regime, of course, and for any Afghan regime for that matter, is to find ways to reconcile somehow, to have a form of governance that is palatable to both of these Afghanistans, and that's clearly over the last 6 months we've seen a huge brain drain, and it's a terrible loss for the country. Of course, it's terrible for the people who left, because as everybody, but in particular Afghans, are very attached to their land.
Yeah. No, and Sebastian, I think I'm going to leave 99 Nights in Logar here, unless you have anything else you'd like to add.
No. I encourage everybody to read it.
Yeah, absolutely. I would also encourage everyone to read it. And I have just a couple of more questions for you as we come towards the conclusion. One thing I like to ask humanitarian workers, I feel that every humanitarian worker has a situation or someone they've met in their working career that has stayed with them for many reasons. And what would that person or situation be for you? What would that story of that one person?
There are quite a few situations that I can think of in people, but I don't really have one specific prominent situation that comes to mind, that has struck me. I mean, I was struck very often going to besieged areas in Syria. One of the things that was one of the job that was key part of the job, as I mentioned, I was head of office there between 2014 and 2017. It was actually to go and deliver whenever we could. And there you were confronted with very dire humanitarian needs. There are massive needs in Syria everywhere, many protection needs, but in these areas we're talking about, sometimes people were very hungry, on the brink of starvation. So the people you meet there and your inability to do more than just bring a little bit of temporary relief. It of course is never enough, and your inability to explain why the multilateral system, which you represent in a sense, is not able to help them by giving the protection. Explain the failure of international protection to them is something that always struck me. So it's not really a person, but it's this being in this difficult position as a humanitarian, when you're faced with, again, the failure of international protection. When we talk about conflict, which is most of the places we work in, there are different levels, but this was really the epitome of in a sense, of this failure, and trying to do your best, and yet, even though people were of course angry, I have to say that there was always a surprisingly dignified welcome, and the very human way of dealing with us from the outside, who just came in and gave them a little bit and left, without being able to address the root causes of their suffering, and which could go on. So that was a good lesson, a good lesson in terms of being humble about what we do.
Right.
But also, as I said about Syria, to recognize that one of our main problem is access. I think this is really the main challenge we're facing, and we need to, one of the ways to address this more complicated world that we're getting into is more tension. There's more conflictuality. Clearly, the international norms that we all depend on are being eroded. The system, the multilateral system is also less effective, and using euphemisms.
Yeah.
And yet, there will be more needs because of these conflicts, because of the ecological crisis and all this. So, how do we reconcile that? And I think one of the ways is by really identifying all the possible entry points where we can leverage politics. Yeah. In order to achieve, to improve humanitarian outcomes, whether it's Security Council or political processes or whatever it may be. I think it's really important for us to do that as a system and as more of the system, but also as individual organizations. Yeah.
No, I 100% agree with you on that, Sebastian. And my final question for you is, if there was, whoever will listen to this conversation, if there was one thing that they can do to address the causes and consequences of humanitarian crisis, what would that be for you?
I mean, I think obviously, people can contribute money, and that's always important. So there are great organizations out there that need money. But I would say that we should never underestimate the impact of public opinion on governments, particularly in countries that are privileged to have more open societies. And I think what people should and can do is to get involved in different ways. Either getting involved in politics or in civil society, or simply just to be aware citizens and push their governments to act to make sure that when they look at their interests, because it's all about interests at the end of the day, right? They factor in the humanitarian imperative, more, right? And I think that can be helpful.
Okay, thank you. That was my last question for you. Do you have any questions for me?
Yes, actually, I was reflecting on this is. I think great work you're doing, but how what is then? I guess it's the end. The end product of all of this is going to be a reflection on the impact of the current and potential future impact of fiction on humanitarian work. But can you say a little bit about this?
And I can say a lot about this as well.
I'm sure, yeah. I want to hear it.
No, I mean, I'm hoping to do as many interviews as I can, and also I'm working with the University of Virginia for my sabbatical, and I'm working with another professor, Adrian, at the University of Virginia. And one of the things is I'm trying to collect as many thoughts and reflections and perspectives, which I'm going to catalog. And then with the University of Virginia and Professor Adrian, we are also looking at starting a book club at really a global scale. So where we can get people to read a fiction book. And then we want to pair that with possible actions that they can take, either through the period of reading or at the end of the book, where we will end with a webinar, bringing together humanitarian practitioners, bringing together writers and people interested in all of this. And then the idea is for me to catalog all of that. And then I'm hoping to convince actually OCHA, that's my organization, to really with this data and with all of these reflections to see how can we be a bit more intentional about using fiction, and also actually you could recommend, like, for example, I feel like almost everyone working in Afghanistan should read 99 Nights in Logar, because it gives you such a powerful and interesting context of the culture and the people. And then to me, it's then how do you pair that with data, which of course is always going to be extremely important. But I'm also think the other piece related to that to me is also just looking at beyond fiction, how can we be more intentional about storytelling? You know, when you're speaking about accountability to affected people, empowering people, and I think when you were talking about this book, one of the things you talked about is agency. To me, I see it really, how do we help people tell their own stories, whether that is through helping them do narrative nonfiction, but to really be able to own and have this space to tell their stories the way that they want to tell them and the parts of their stories that they want to share. And so again, to me, that's kind of combining those two things and trying to see, hopefully get OCHA buy into that is one of the outcomes that I would see from all of this.
Interesting. I hope you succeed.
No, I hope so, and thank you. But I also hope that if I don't succeed in this, I still hope that whoever listens to these conversations will certainly learn something about humanitarian crisis, about what people are going through. And then I hope they'll be a bit more interested in learning more and engaging in some way. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you for your time today, and thank you so much really for listening to this conversation with Sebastian. This is Saha, Stories and Humanitarian Action. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, like, comment, and share this video. I'd like to thank my co-producer, Jamal Swift, and I'd also like to thank the Nomadic Band for the music. Thank you.